Good morning, everyone. We're gonna have to try that again. Good morning, everyone. Might be one more time. Good morning, everybody. All right, that's more like it. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Eli Dvorkin. I'm the Editorial and Policy Director at the Center for an Urban Future. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's conference. We are thrilled to have all of you in the room. We are joined by around 150 or so people who are tuning in online. So hello to all of you. Thanks for joining us. The one thing you all virtually don't get is the food. So we totally appreciate everybody's got to eat, have lunch. But we are going to get right into the program. So if you do need to grab anything from outside, please grab it now and then come on in and join us. Let me just say a couple of quick words about this morning's event before it becomes the afternoon. You know, in our work at the Center for an Urban Future, we focus on elevating important but often overlooked and underappreciated issues under the radar of public officials. A key first step to sparking policy changes and needed investments. You know, whether it's spotlighting the crucial role of branch libraries or documenting the need to better support the mostly low-income first-generation college students attending our public colleges, or making the case for greater state and city investments in New York's parks and open spaces, our work offers policymakers fact-based research and achievable ideas for creating a more vibrant, livable, and equitable state. You know, that's very much the case with our October report, Upstate's Creative Spark, which revealed that very few state economic development efforts have had as powerful an economic and social impact across upstate New York as an often overlooked catalyst, the arts. Employment in the arts and culture sector across upstate New York surged 35% from 2009 to 2019, nearly 10 times the overall rate of employment growth in the state. Likewise, the resident artist population grew 26.5% across upstate New York between 2011 and 2021, a time when many upstate cities have seen little overall population growth and the under 65 population actually declined. You know, this increased economic vitality sparked by the arts and culture sector has created the conditions for sustained economic growth and helped drive up tourism spending by more than 50% in the decade prior to the pandemic. But of course, the power of the arts can hardly be reduced to revenues and tax receipts. The growth of the arts and culture sector has also inspired more young people who grew up or earned degrees locally to stay in their upstate communities, to start jobs and businesses and put down roots. And artists have proven to be essential workers throughout the pandemic, from leading mutual aid efforts to feed their neighbors to helping communities heal from trauma and imagine brighter futures once again. But for years, if not decades, New York State and its local counties and municipalities have struggled to provide sufficient funding for the arts and to invest in the visions that artists have for their communities. And at the same time, even though the arts sector has become a crucial catalyst for economic opportunity, the state's economic development tools too often overlook the arts and culture sector and the state's working artists. But change is possible, and New York's artists, as always, are the vanguard of envisioning that change. So I am thrilled today that we'll have a forum that will delve into these opportunities, that will fully lay out some visions for integrating the arts into the state's economic development strategies, and I hope lay the groundwork for a more vibrant and creative New York. I want to take a moment to thank Rochester Area Community Foundation for supporting our report, and a big thank you to Creatives Rebuild New York for making today's event possible and partnering with us on this program today. And I'd also like to thank all of our amazing speakers, several of whom came here from other parts of the state to be with us all today, and also especially to State Senators Sean Ryan and Jose Serrano, who will be up here shortly. But for now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, New York State Council on the Arts Executive Director Erica Mallon, and she will be followed by the beginning of our program. So welcome, Erica. Absolutely. Thanks for being here.
All right, so I was unfashionably late, and then I also told Eli I'd be super short, but I think I might be a tad long, so just bear with me for a second. There's a lot to say about our sector and our communities. So, but first I want to start by thanking Governor Hochul and the state legislature for their incredible investment in the arts. In FY24, we have awarded over $80 million to date to over 2,000 artists and organizations in all 10 regions of our state, and this includes re-grants to service organizations and local arts council to even, spread our dollars even further. I also want to thank the Center for Urban Future and Creatives Rebuild for organizing today's event, and I guess Senator Serrano and Senator Ryan, who will be joining us, for their profound commitment to arts within their districts and across the entire state. And of course, our fabulous host, the Albany Institute of History and Art, which is proud to say, NISCA grantee, and today's panelists who bring expertise and insights from across the arts and our entire ecosystem. So I joined NISCA about a month and a half ago, and it's a true honor to champion artists and organizations that make up our state's creative industry. I previously served as executive director of Signature Theater in New York City for over 10 years, where we went from a very small black box theater to a gigantic theater performance center on 42nd Street with a budget of $15 million. I don't recommend that for everyone, but we did do it. So I do understand very clearly the everyday challenges and the entrepreneurial spirit necessary to be an artist, to cultivate artists, and also to produce art. There is nothing like that feeling when you are in a museum or in a performing arts space and you're gathered together, which we need to do more of, experiencing art together. And if one person is changed, just one, we have done our job. More recently, I led the Aspen Institute Arts Program, where I convened artists and cultural leaders, grant makers, policy experts, and civic leaders from around the nation on how we approach our most challenging issues in our communities and in our society. So I know the importance of studies like this and how important it is for all of you to be here to exchange ideas and be in forums that I believe, allow for a great exchange of ideas that will move us forward. Because I do believe New York State can be the big bank of ideas and lead the way for innovation in our field to support our industry and to promote the health and wealth of our communities. And because we know that these things are inextricably connected. What the Center for Urban Future's Upstate Creative Spark report clearly shows is that where there are arts, our people, communities, and our state thrive. The arts and culture sector contributes over, and I'm sure you've heard some of these numbers, but I'm just going to repeat them one more time, $144 billion back to our state and communities, employs over 450,000 workers, constituting almost 8% of our state's economy, driving tourism, boosting revenue for local businesses and services. The report also details that where there are nonprofit arts organizations and artists, it creates the necessary conditions for these areas to do better, including retaining their population and businesses and drawing in more people and investment, as Eli spoke about. For example, 3 recent studies of Western New York, Long Island, and Westchester reported a combined $900 million generated by their nonprofit arts sector, and it supported over 14,000 jobs, and on average, attendees spent more than $30 in addition to ticket prices, money that went straight into local economies. This creative spark also documented that the pre-pandemic arts and culture sector was the fastest growing industry in the state, and that in particular, upstate artists' employment and population outpaced total growth in nearly every major city. We know, all of us know here, the impact of the creative sector, but we are at a crossroads. A large part of the industry was the first to shut down and the last to open. Going forward, we face the challenges of increasing costs, diminishing revenue, changes in consumer habits, and in philanthropy, decreasing audiences and revenues, and aging infrastructure. So what is next for this industry that gives so much, employs so many, revitalizes communities, and attracts visitors? There are very important recommendations brought forth by this report, that can, I think that can help us inform how we can play both the long and short game to serve our arts economy and our communities, and in ways that serve the diversity of our communities as well. So let me tell you what NISCA is doing to meet these rapidly evolving needs. So as a rule, we provide general operating support, and for many arts and cultural institutions, that is the golden ticket. It funds the everyday, turning on the lights, opening the doors, and employing artists. NISCA is often the only source in certain areas for this kind of support. And NISCA's support also brings a stamp of approval that leverages additional funds, while also embracing for, 50 years, the creation of new work and programs that influence the next generation of artists. And we also provide much needed capital project funding and arts placemaking and critical facility improvements that can revitalize communities for decades to come. And I want to note some examples. I'll mention some of you might be here in the room, but I think these are good examples for all of us to look at. Torn Space Theater has reimagined long neglected spaces in the east side of Buffalo, and their recent facility expansion will bring much needed cultural access and engagement for their community. Art Space Utica Lofts, a capital grantee in the Mohawk Valley region, just broke ground on a 40,000 plus square foot building with space for low-income artists and their families to live, work, exhibit, and perform in downtown Utica. Arts Council for Wyoming in North Country, who gives grants to artists for projects that celebrate the connection between arts and the land while building bridges across extremely geographically isolated communities. Rochester Fringe Festival, which draws over 60,000 visitors from across the world to the Finger Lakes region to experience over 500 performances in a 12-day span. That's a lot. And finally, right here in Albany, Youth FX, which empowers young people from historically underserved communities through training and access in digital film and media arts. And going forward, we have a few more priorities, including new state-of-the-state initiatives, such as public art programs, like murals, which are often the first point of entry for arts engagement for our communities, uplifting our artists, and creating new destinations. We also want to embed artists within state agencies, where there are tremendous potential for artists to discover creative solutions, bridge silos, and inspire innovation in the way we provide public services. It is also a priority for us to build out a public-facing NISCA through new cross-sector partnerships and high-profile convenings like these, so we can further the creative thinking and truly be actors in our field and in our communities. And what we do here in New York State matters. As Governor Hochul has said, New York is a microcosm of the nation, encompassing an incredible breadth of geographic and creative diversity, from rural areas to small and mid-sized city, and with a global megacity. What we do in and around the state can influence so many around the nation at this critical juncture, and you are all part of this. You can today create new momentum that squarely connects the dots between the arts, economic development, philanthropy, and government. So our work moving forward, I believe, is that we must recognize this moment as a unique opportunity to rethink our cultural and funding landscapes. We must continue to elevate the arts as a powerful catalyst for the health and wealth of our communities and our state. We must embrace, and finally, we must embrace the power of collaboration and bring more stakeholders and creative thinkers from all sectors to create the big tent. So today, here and now, let this be a moment for bold thinking to set the stage for what we can do this year, next year, and beyond to serve our sector, our state, our residents and visitors alike, and for the greater good. So thank you for the honor of addressing you today, and I look forward to working with all of you in the coming months.
channel one of my one of our panelists and say, break a leg. We're all behind you in the work you're doing, and really appreciate everything. So could our panelists come and join me? The first group of panelists, come on, join me on the stage. Thank you so much. And just letting everyone in the room know, your agendas are in front of you, but we're going to move directly from our first conversation into our second panel with the two state senators. So hang on to your seats, and we will move through the conversation together, but we will save time for questions from the audience for both panels. I'm sure this will spark a lot in the room. And for folks that are tuned in online, you can tweet at me at WetWax on Twitter or at NYC Future and send your questions that way too. But let me just very briefly mention who is up on our panel, because they may not be in exactly the order that you see them on the screen. So folks in the room know, to my left is Sarah Calderon, the Executive Director of Creatives Are Built New York. Hold your applause, please. We will go through everyone, or we'll be here all day. Next, we have Jade Warwick, who's joined us as well, artist based here in the Capital Region. Erica Fee, the founding producer of the Rochester Fringe Festival. Chayla Surratt, the co-founder of Black Artists Collective and an entrepreneur herself based in Syracuse, New York. Ryan Silva, the executive director of the New York State Economic Development Council. And last but certainly not least, Kevin O'Connor, the CEO of RUPCO, the great community and housing development organization based in the Hudson Valley. Welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being here. A round of applause is totally appropriate at this point. Thank you, everybody. So let's get right into it. We started this day, and frankly, the conversations that we've had before today, talking about what's actually working. I mean, there's a lot of folks here in Albany today, big lobby day on, in the Capitol. And frankly, a lot of folks are here to talk about what's not working, the bad news, the problems in our state, the rise of poverty since last year, the challenges around our inability to produce enough housing. There's a lot of big problems facing New York State right now. But I'd like to change the tone a little bit and actually talk about something that's working. And I think that our report shows is not only working, but frankly, has never gotten the credit that it's due. And that's what working artists and arts organizations are doing right now in New York State to strengthen our state, to produce the conditions that enable economic growth and economic vitality, to be able to build more equitable and inclusive cities and places in rural areas as well. So let me start with a jump ball for all of you, and anybody can start. What's working right now?
I can go.
Thanks,
Because
Dave.
I love the Capital Region for what it does for the arts. So I just want to put some amazing initiatives and programs on. One of my favorites is the Capitol Wall Initiative by Albany Center Gallery, led by Tony Idesico and his team. That is an initiative that transforms cityscapes into basically a vibrant gallery space. If you've been to downtown Albany, you may have seen some amazing murals down there. Most of those are through the Capitol Walls Initiative. And I think it's really important to have projects like this, because not only does it support artists like me, who they gave me my first mural, which launched my career off substantially, they also are able to revitalize the downtown area from it not being so dreary and gray, but also bring in business and make it a tourist attraction as well. And that's something I really appreciate about the Capitol Walls Initiative, is not only does it give artists like me and others the opportunity to create and believe in us and provide support, but also really provide support to the city, make it this vibrant landscape that also increases business, that increases flow to businesses. People come down to downtown just to see the murals down there. So I think that's really important. And I have just two more, keep it short because I know we're on a time limit. The Electric City Barn in Schenectady is also great. They took an old historic building, revitalized it to be an artistic hub and an artistic space for artists to thrive. They also have affordable studio space, free materials, and you can just, it is just so affordable to go there. And again, it revitalized that historic building that no one was using and created a community hub for artists to come and flourish and have studio space for cheap. And then one last thing is the Elizabeth Murray residency by Collarworks. That's another really accessible residency program. And a lot of residency programs are not accessible. They're very expensive to get into. So that's just another one that I want to bring up, because it builds cultural capital and attracts creative talent. We want to have folks to come to these beautiful, robust residencies so they can stay in New York, so they can keep adding to our economy, so they can keep being artists here and not just leaving the places like Detroit, Berlin, Los Angeles. We want our artists here. So we need to make sure that we have those initiatives like the three that I've listed available for artists so we can flourish. So those are just some things that we're doing correct in the area.
Thanks, Jade. And we'll talk a lot more about what the state can do to support those types of initiatives. But for the moment, I'd just love to hear other folks on what is working right now.
Well, I'll jump in. One thing that's working for Rochester Fringe, I know we're going to talk about what is the Rochester Fringe later. It's the state's largest multidisciplinary performing arts festival. But because of certain challenges, for example, how difficult it is to now gain work visas for artists and how time consuming, there are many organizations across the state that without special funding, without introduction, are finding each other, creating block bookings. There's currently a kind of a semi-partnership between us, Art Park, Lincoln Center, Upstate, Circus Festival in Ithaca, and we're all talking at least probably once a day, trying to facilitate ways that we can bring in artists and we can all collaborate together. So I think that that's really working. We have had a few partnerships the last couple of years, and those have been really, really exciting shows.
That's great, Erica. Thanks. Whoever wants to jump in, go for it. Yeah,
I can jump in. I think what's exciting for us is that we're actually supporting 300 artists across New York State with jobs, right? So they're all working and they're all doing this just absolutely amazing work to build on what Jade said. One example is the Black Library, which is 2 artists in Monticello and Sullivan County, Doug Schindler and Mike Davis, have taken a former bank and created a sort of arts and cultural mecca for folks in that community, but not only in that community. They have local, regional, and national folks coming to visit just to see sort of what this space has become, right? So they've converted this former bank. They've created the cubicles are now artist in residence spaces. The vault is the backdrop for all of the community performances and the open mic nights. And they're really doing a few things, right? They're supporting Black and other artists of color. They are supporting the connections between the community there, bringing people together. They're pushing on the trope of sort of what upstate New York artists look like, who they are, and they're providing this amazing library and cultural space for their community.
I would say, first, I would say that we're having this conversation. I think so often in the spaces that I'm working in Syracuse, New York, that there isn't a synergistic conversation about how we contribute, that without art, so often in these conversations about bringing in new and diverse industries, that they talk about quality of life. Well, that is us. And so I think that it is important that it's odd. There are times where I'm like, it's a little bit of a vortex here. But I think even just having the conversation, I think that is a success, to really having conversations beyond economic development and workforce development, that we are the people who are the keepers and caretakers of our history and culture, and that we should be making sure that we are having holistic conversations. That's what I'm very much excited about in the work that happened with Creative Rebuild New York, is that artists are pouring into their practice, but we also need to pour into them and thinking about their health and thinking about their living situations as well. So I'm really pleased that we're having that at the forefront of these conversations.
Well, there were so many good things said before I got a chance to speak, so I'll just highlight a couple of things. For one, quality of life is without a doubt the hidden metric within economic development. We talk about job creation as though it's the one and only thing that economic development success should be measured by. And the reality is economic development is about building sustainable communities where people want to live, work, and play. And in order to do that, and I'm going to borrow from what Director Mallon said from NISCA, you have to have all the partners working together, whether it's public, private, academic, non-for-profit, philanthropic. Everybody has a responsibility and a role, and at certain times, government needs to take more of a role, the private sector needs to take more of a role. There are just handfuls of great examples across this state. I'm a Troy boy originally, so I'm going to give a shout out to Liz and the Art Center for the Capital Region. Shout out to Collarworks and Jeff Morrell and the work that they're doing. Our members, Emma Cassidy from Catalyzing Albany. You look around the different parts of this state, whether it's in Dutchess County, the DIA location in Beacon, that really jump-started the revitalization of Beacon over 20 years ago. It was a project undertaken by the Dutchess County Economic Development Corporation, where you're leveraging public-private dollars to generate change within a community. I've got a bunch of other examples from around the state. I'm sure I'll get to some of them, Eli, but the more we're all working together, collaborating, sharing ideas, the better off we're going to be.
So as a housing and community development nonprofit in the Hudson Valley, we've had the opportunity to get involved in a number of projects, particularly with some arts group, often Black-led arts groups, to create some space in our mixed-use housing. But I was actually going to start with the Black Library as well, because we've had a key role there in Monticello, working with the land bank. And there's, you know, there's this block of Broadway, and it was completely empty 7 years ago, including the Key Bank building and the Strong building, and two of these buildings that just bookend. And so working with the land bank, we were able to purchase the Key Bank building from Key Bank, and it's an amazing space with the big vault and all of this stuff. So while, in addition to some of the other projects I can talk about, we haven't even really started the renovation yet of these two buildings, and we want to do affordable housing above, and Black Library is going to definitely be, you know, the long-term tenant, but they were able to move in, and it's amazing what they've been able to do already with the space. And so throughout the Hudson Valley, we have some examples in Newburgh and in Kingston of getting together with arts organizations and bringing about mixed use, and I think it's proved very fruitful.
That's great. Well, I appreciate all those thoughts to give us something hopeful at the beginning of this conversation. And all those examples, I think, are inspiring. And there's obviously, as you mentioned, many more. But I did want to ask a little bit about the more sobering side of this equation, you know, where we are right now when it comes to the state of the arts. You know, the governor gave her State of the State speech just a few weeks ago, and we'll talk about what was in that and specifically ideas around the arts, which we're really excited about. But I wanted to ask all of you, maybe briefly, to help us understand, what do you see as the state of the arts in New York right now? How are artists faring? How are arts organizations doing? Where are we right now at the beginning of 2024?
It's a challenging time. I think that it's interesting. I think about that during the global pandemic, you know, we were, you know, very much online, making things and helping people maintain their sanity. And the realities are is that now that we are on the other side, I'm thinking about in Syracuse, New York, where live entertainment has seen a 30% reduction in patronage. And the realities are is that we are also trying to understand the metrics of how do we get them back in, right, now that the doors are open. So I think that's the sobering reality. The other sobering reality, too, I'll say in Syracuse, New York, is that really trying to encourage our municipalities to be more invested in the arts as well as part of their larger re-envisioning, re-imagining, urban renewal kind of projects that they're working on. We have a lot of support from our county executive, but I'd like to see some of that also shared within our municipalities as well.
I totally echo that. Monroe County, exactly the same. I would say extremely challenging time. Live arts attendance has not rebounded, as you all know, nationwide, particularly for indoor shows. The investments have not been made in keeping our interior spaces healthy. To be quite honest, we have not all leaned into good ventilation, et cetera. And I think that there is, it's not that I think, there is a huge percentage of the population that's unwilling to attend indoor events, coupled with the fact that there's no more federal funding for pandemic rebound. It's a super, super tricky time. I'll just give you a small example, though, just from Rochester. Let's talk about porta potties. Something.
You know, that's where we were going.
I never thought.
When were they going to get to porta potties?
We're going there. I'll just give you a little price quote that we had last year for from porta potty vendors. It's something I now know way too much about, but if you need one, I'm your gal. We had previously paid about $8,000 per year for porta potties, and I don't mean just, you know, the typical porta potties. I mean nice ones that plug in, that flush. You know, we always say we like our patrons. We want them to come back. That's how much it cost for a 12-day festival. We budgeted an increase. We knew that there was inflation, of course. The price quotes that we were getting were in the region from 3 different vendors, and those were the only vendors, of $30,000. I started looking up how to buy a porta potty. Good, I keep it in my driveway. Perhaps I should go into the porta potty business myself. Could Rochester Fringe have a for-profit income stream? These questions actually were raised at the board level. I'm not even joking. So that kind of inflation and that kind of price gouging that's happening, and when you can really almost do nothing about it, this is creating a further problem in addition to the lack of funding federally. That it just, it's so trying. I don't know how many arts organizations will continue to exist.
And I think for organizations, but also for artists, right? Our artists are still living in precarity, and they are being forced to make decisions about sort of switching careers or moving away from the state. They're often gig workers, as I think everyone in this room knows, and are really don't get the protections, the worker protections, if they were getting W-2 full-time employment. And they're also burdened by the increase in housing costs. You wanted all the bad news, right? And the lack of affordability in the state. For Creatives Rebuild New York, when we announced our funding, guaranteed income, we had 22,000 folks apply, for artists from across the state, which means that 22,000 folks said that they were below the self-sufficiency standard that we had set for them to be able to live in their communities. We had 10,000 artists apply for employment, right? And so the need is clear. And we were able to fund 2,700, which in some ways seems big, but when you think about the need and the reality out there, it's just not.
I'll just echo what Erica was talking about, not porta potties, because I'm not an expert in that arena. But the federal funding drying up is a real concern, right? ARPA funds, most of them are either on their way out the door or already committed. Inflation across the board costs to do anything. I was literally actually joking about building porta potties on Long Island, like what are the property taxes on it going to be? Because we're having such a challenge with housing across the state, but also is access to capital. Interest rates are through the roof, and where there was flexibility, I think, around lending, and there was the desire and ability for a lot of other funding partners to absorb some of the risk. There just isn't that desire to go out there and take on riskier investments. So you have a lot of different things all at once coming together, where you've got rising costs, lack of access to capital, lack of public dollars being spent, which creates a real challenge for artists, communities, and the arts in general across the state.
Well, we're not alone. I was at the Hudson Valley Economic Development Council presentation this morning talking about how pessimistic CEOs and others are about the challenges that folks are facing, the lack of funding, government regulation, so on and so forth. Our core business is housing, and it's been mentioned quite a few times already from this arts panel and how difficult it is. We got started really in coming to embrace the arts community through housing when we repurposed the former lace mill factory in the city of Kingston as artist housing. And so I think we're all facing challenges, but the arts can bring so much in terms of helping us to cope with the challenges, that we need to fund it. And one of my board members is here today, Greer Smith. Greer runs the fantastic Trans Art in the Hudson Valley, and if you happen to be in Kingston on a Sunday afternoon, she's got some great jazz series going on in a small, intimate setting. Truly wonderful. But we're going to work with her, and she's got some funding to we're going to do a joint reading of a book with some of our residents. We're really looking forward to it. Their eyes were watching God, and it's an example of how coming together with housing and arts-related activity, I think, can help on the coping side. It's not going to answer all the questions that are up here, though.
I did want to bring up one other point. In looking at, I'm looking at some information that was given to me, from our regional grant organization and Central CNY Arts, and thinking about that through our room occupancy tax that we were able to generate for the county $2 million. Much of what went to our amazing anchor organizations in downtown Syracuse, which is wonderful. It creates a dynamic synergy in that region. But when I get down to the number of $252,000, which is going to grassroots organizations, it concerns me because it makes me think about what you're saying in terms of that art is also holistic and it's doing other work, it's doing other lifts. Particularly when I look at Governor Hochul's proposal and the work that you've done, is that a lot of it is also doing wraparound services. So we have organizations that are situated within those communities that have seen historic disenfranchisement, are also dealing with the legacy of racism. So not only are they taking all of that funding, some of that funding, they're taking that funding and putting it into dynamic artistic programming, but they're also then having to think about that these communities are situated within areas that are dealing with people being unhoused, food disparity, and in Syracuse, New York, we have lead levels higher than Flint, Michigan. So when we're navigating those, it's also thinking about the intentional allocation and equitable allocation of funding and thinking about that $2 million and how do we be more equitable in making sure that we're supporting organizations that have dynamic arts programming, but also are doing care and wraparound services as well.
Jayla, well, I want to build on that point and ask a little bit more in the direction of where the state can and should be going with its support for the arts, with integrating artists and arts organizations to help address some of these bigger challenges, including, as Kevin mentioned, even things like housing. But Sarah, I want to bring you in on this point because you're running an experiment right now, arguably the largest experiment of its kind anywhere in the country and certainly in New York's history, getting dollars directly into the hands of working artists to not only pursue their practices, but crucially to embed in other organizations that have never had an artist on staff before, on site before. So tell us a little bit about not just kind of what you're doing, but what have you learned so far? What should policymakers know about the first couple of years of this program that could be instructive for starting to address these other opportunities?
Thanks. Okay, I'll be quick, but two things. I think the first is that, creatives are really essential for rebuilding the state. When CRNY was developed, it was because Elizabeth Alexander, the head of the Mellon Foundation, was on the Reimagine New York Commission and thinking about workforce development. And there was a real consensus that it was important that creatives really had a place at the table to help rebuild the state. So they can preserve cultural identity, all the things that folks have said here. They can contribute to community wealth building. They can imagine new economic structures for us. They can do quite a bit of sort of work and contributing to their communities, but they can also further the mission of the organizations that they are collaborating with and working with. And so I think jobs are important. Jobs matter, not just funding organizations, which we also do, but making sure that there's actually money and jobs for artists. The second I think that we've learned is that cash works. So folks, we have 2,400 artists across New York State that are getting $1,000 a month of unrestricted, no strings attached funds for 18 months. And what artists are doing has been just sort of amazing. They're able to stay in New York State. They're able to contribute to their economies. They are, and they're using it for things like rent. They're using it for childcare. They're using it for groceries. They're using it to actually pay their colleagues who they're working with, their fellow artists, their musicians, their bandmates, their dance partners. And they're also using it to think through and to take and be more choosy, have the freedom to choose the better gig or the better next job, right? The one that can actually pay more and can help support their artistic practice as well. So.
Thanks, Sarah. Eric, let me ask you something similar, but looking a little bit at your own experience building what's now become a real institution in Rochester, really from the ground up. I'm curious what you see as kind of the lessons for policymakers in what you've done. How can the state learn from your experience and help replicate it or advance those kinds of opportunities in other parts of New York?
Well, first, I'll describe a little bit what we are. So as I said, we're a multidisciplinary performing arts festival. We exist for 12 days in September, about 500 shows in those 12 days, and generally in attendance pre-pandemic of about 100,000 attendees. We are based upon the Edinburgh Fringe model, which many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with, the largest arts festival in the world. When you look at Edinburgh Fringe numbers, it's Olympics #1, World Cup #2, Edinburgh Fringe #3. So, absolutely massive. And has resulted in the birth of about 250 fringe festivals worldwide. When we were starting ours, we started looking at different models, and our first year was 2012. That was the first year of our festival. And we started looking at different models, and what we decided and we determined is that each festival really needs to be reflective of its own community. So we pulled in an Edinburgh Fringe model, a component where our 30 venues would program themselves, but we also decided that we would program some shows ourselves. So we would bring in some, I hate the term headliner, but some very unique entertainment, let's say, and that was to draw people to the festival, and hopefully they would stay, see other shows. Some of their shows, though, have been works like Plasticien Volant, who we brought in from the south of France twice, a show with huge, giant inflatables. We worked with Art Park on that, too. They also brought them in. We brought in this past year another show I saw in France. Go figure, they've got a lot of funding for spectacle entertainment, called Cirque and Extremiste, which involved a full-size hot air balloon with acrobats hanging off of it. We typically draw about 20 to 28,000 people to these shows, free outdoor shows. And it really invigorates and energizes the downtown sector, certainly seeing more people than we normally do. But one thing that we have learned, and I'm so happy that I saw this in the report, is that some of that funding has come from Market New York that has enabled us to be able to put on those huge spectacle type performances. These are very, very complicated shows. They take years to bring in to New York. We have to find other partners. Generally, American presenters have to find the other partners themselves. It's not like they have an agent. And so we have to actually bang the tour together ourselves and figure out all the logistics, everything from helium to sand to things that can't even be imagined. One challenge that we have found through the I Love New York, Market New York funding right now is that it's one-offs. You never know if you're going to get it again. And in fact, some of the guidance says that if you've been awarded it 3 or 4 times, you probably won't ever win it again, which means those organizations that are super successful and are showing, success, they may be ineligible. And I mean, I frankly think that's a little unfair. So that's something that's a takeaway.
Thanks, Erica. Jill, I want to ask you something about what you were saying earlier about what's happening in Syracuse. And I think part of it is this connection, and actually I think Ryan said it really well earlier, that we need to be looking at other metrics to define economic success. And that in part, that means quality of life. I'm curious what else you see as the right ways to understand if investments in the arts are working, what success really looks like. And from your experience, maybe even going beyond those kind of more limited economic indicators, what would that success look like on the ground in Syracuse? How do you achieve more of it?
Well, first and foremost, I think the word money has been said here. I think money, but in an intentional way. I'm very much a proponent of participatory processes, that in so many times there are rooms in which we don't see artists, and so having those who are most directly affected by the policies or the funding in those rooms, I think would be very helpful. I think about what are models for success and how can arts be impactful. I serve on the board of the Community Folk Arts Center, which is a branch of the African American Studies Department at Syracuse University. It's also a 501c3. So in addition to all of its educational programming and its exhibitions and things like that, we have the Creative Arts Academy. And that is from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. We have a safe place for children to be. And in addition to, of course, them having access to all those wonderful arts things, we also know that parents know their children are safe, and we can do social emotional learning through arts as a conduit. And so I think these are the other things that we offer into those spaces beyond economic development. I also think I had the privilege, again, of being in conversation with a lot of those creative arts applicants. And what I also really found is that they were seen. I think a lot of these conversations about being seen and being heard and being valued, there were so many times in which part of this conversation, I think, is allowing artists to imagine a world in which, again, it isn't just about their art practice or in service to economic development or workforce development. But I remember being in conversations quite pointedly where they would say, I've chosen the arts institution, I know how I'm going to be in service to community, and then the conversation would stop. And I'd say, well, what about you? What are your needs? And they would say, well, I have a project in mind. I say, no, what about your housing needs? What about your food needs? What about your health needs? And so I think what I'm also looking for is the intentionality, municipal, regional, county, federal, an intentionality around what do our artists need and having them be part of a participatory process.
Appreciate that. And on that note, let me ask you, Kevin, about one of those needs, which is housing, obviously. Almost everyone's now mentioned in the room. There's no question the Hudson Valley, like the rest of the state, is dealing with an entrenched housing crisis. You have not only been working, hard for decades to build housing and affordable housing, specifically in the Hudson Valley, but I think somewhat uniquely across the state to integrate a focus on the arts, space for artists to work and to present. I'm curious, from your perspective, Kevin, what's needed to do more of that? If the state or local county officials or municipal officials see what you're doing at REPCO and say, that's actually really fascinating, we should be doing more of it, what can they do to help? How could the state take action that would allow more projects like those that you've spearheaded to come to fruition?
Yeah, well, it took the state a little while to come around to artist housing in the first place. Art Space was here for a while, knocking on doors and not really making much headway. The HERA Act of 2008 really codified artist housing as a preference, and when we were contemplating the Lace Mill, we brought Ann Markison in, who was sort of an early thought leader on creative placemaking, and she'd written books on it and stuff, but she had a simple construct that has always stuck with me, and that is, how do you know you have creative placemakers? When you get someplace and you want to find a place to park because it's a place you want to linger, you want to hang out. So clearly the economic development we've been able to use. I started doing a lot of revitalization work and then a lot of affordable housing work, and now much of the housing has been mixed use, and we've really looked to the arts organization. Energy Square, the first net zero housing in upstate New York, affordable, was really brought about to relocate the Center for Creative Education. They needed a new home. We found an empty bowling alley right in Midtown Kingston, knocked it down, put the center, and built housing above. I think that we should look, I think the compelling arguments are economic development and the holistic healing work. We're in the city of Newburgh. We've been there about 7-8 years. At one point, Newburgh had 1,000 vacant buildings. We're doing affordable housing and some historic restoration. We repurposed an old church, sidecar school building, and the city needs what we term it. The city needs a lot of love, and what better partner than arts organizations being involved in helping us to not just provide homes, but to provide services, arts, opportunities, jobs, and just a whole lot of love.
So, Ryan, let me ask you something that builds off of that point, I think, and gets at more of the specifics around what the state can do. So when we did for the research that resulted in Upstate's Creative Spark, we didn't just talk to artists and arts organizations, art services organizations, and funders. We spoke to a lot of economic development officials all over the state. I would say, generally speaking, they broke down into 3 camps. There were folks that got what we're talking about here today, and that are actively pursuing opportunities to take economic development dollars and tools and use those to help cultivate space for the arts or opportunities for the arts. That's, I would say, the smallest camp, but they're inspiring. Then there was, I would say, a much bigger camp of folks that see the opportunities here, are intrigued by them, want to kind of do more, and I would say don't really know what to do or haven't really figured out how to kind of take concrete steps in this direction because it may not be the tools and processes and strategies that they're familiar with. And then I'd say there's a smallish group, but significant, of folks that really aren't thinking about this today from their vantage points. I would say told us explicitly in some cases, that's not really our mission, and we're a mission-driven organization. We need to focus on creating jobs. We need to focus on having that direct economic impact. So I'm heartened to say that I think over a decade or more, there are more economic development officials and organizations in that first camp maybe than ever. But it also is certainly the smallest, I think, of the 3. So if you agree, and let me know if you disagree, with this basic kind of premise that there's such power in cultivating arts and culture as a mechanism of ensuring that communities can really thrive, that does create the conditions for local and inclusive economic growth, and you started at that point, Ryan. What do we need to do to move more of those local economic development officials and, frankly, state officials into that first camp, and how do you get them there?
Answer to your first question, yes. The answer to your second question, tell them to talk to me personally. No. So there's layers upon layers in New York, right? You have local governments, you have state government, you have county government, and likewise you have layers of economic development. So you have municipalities, counties, and localities that have their own economic development offices. You have the 501c6s of the world, like Center for Economic Growth, Greater Rochester Enterprise, all doing fantastic work. You have LDCs, local development corporations. They have a specific purpose. They have specific tools in the toolbox. And you have IDAs, industrial development agencies. Again, they have specific tools, specific things that they can utilize to drive economic investment and growth. I think one of the things we need to do is just continue to emphasize best practices. So where there are examples of projects, programs, and initiatives that have worked, and put those out in front of local economic developers. I look at what Comida's done with Innovation Square. I look at a theater project in Kingston. It is undeniable what the arts has done for downtown Troy. I'm going to go back to Troy, but also Proctor's Theater in Schenectady. The revitalization that has occurred around downtown Schenectady does not happen without Proctor's Theater being the anchor down there, bringing people in for shows, which leads to the YMCA locating downtown, which leads to Frog Alley and their development, which leads to breweries and restaurants and housing and corporate offices suddenly wanting to be within a community. A lot of the things that I see in economic development too is we're looking for the overnight fix, right? Economic development is a journey. We have a quote we use in our office, Shelby and I. It takes a lifetime of work to become an overnight success. What happened in Troy took 20 plus years to become the new Brooklyn, as we were calling it. So we need to focus on not just grand slam projects, right? Those are important. But as a baseball person, singles and doubles matter. Doing the little things within a community are critically important to driving growth. So to those local economic development entities that say, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't be focusing on that, I would say, or we can't, because that's the other thing we get, they get beat up because they may focus on a project that doesn't create a ton of jobs, but it revitalizes a neighborhood or restores a vacant or blighted property back to life. Tell them that, the general municipal law that governs IDAs says you should be working on cultural community development projects. It's in section 852 and 856 of the general municipal law, not to get all wonky, but the reality is the tools are there. We just have to reimagine how we utilize them and recognize and understand that if you want to reverse population decline in parts of New York State, you have to build communities that people want to live in, work in, and play in, and that includes having cultural assets, having the arts as part of that conversation and discussion at the table.
Thanks, Brian. Well, let's talk about another one of those concrete ideas for achieving that, for building those communities that people want to live, work, and play in. And that's a proposal from the governor from this year. I don't know that a lot of folks really picked up on this really exciting set of initiatives in the state of the state called Arts Pluribus Unum. It includes 3 specific proposals that I wanted to ask you all about today. And I'll start with the first one. So the first proposal, and Director Mallon briefly alluded to this, is around a new level of state support for public art. Well, we're very fortunate to have Jade with us on the panel, who is not only an experienced public artist, but also facilitator of public art projects. So let me just start there by saying, first of all, what's your quick argument for the state to do this? It's not a done deal just yet. And if the state wants to be successful with a statewide public art initiative, what should they do?
What should they do? So in my opinion, a successful public art program includes working with diverse and engaging with diverse communities, first and foremost, in the art making process. You don't want to just throw a mural up into a community and just not talk to anybody or have any engagement. It's a large public piece of work. You want to make sure people are involved in a giant public piece of work. So just making sure the communities are involved, a big one, which we've all said. Ensuring equitable access to funding for the artists is a big one. If you want to have these leaders and these program leaders and these public art leaders and these initiatives, pay the people and you'll get good work. If you pay your workers well, if you pay the artists well, they will give great work and they will be really intentional and holistic about how it's put out. as well as making sure to foster collaborations between artists, between communities, between local organizations, and not excluding government or city-led organizations as well. You know, I think that's really important within a lot of my projects, including Gems of Troy, which was with the Art Center and CollarWorks and the City of Troy, and a couple of other collaboration partners within that. But that mural would have never happened if those community-driven pieces and the intentional about talking to the community was put in that program and in that initiative. That give you some background. Gems of Troy is a 36-pillar mural initiative and project that was done under the CollarWorks City Bridge. That bridge actually has a pretty bad historical rep. It came into a community. They built this into a community. They did not talk to the community. This caused trauma within the community. People are trying to build generational wealth that was disappeared once a huge highway goes into your neighborhood. So you have all these Black, brown, and indigenous communities really trying to build and foster their own community, bringing it up. And then all of a sudden the city just throws a freeway or a highway in the middle of it. No questions asked. Values are down. Crime is up. Pollution is up. Lack of access is now a thing. Gang violence got up. When I spoke to people in the community, I'm not from New York, I'm from Los Angeles, so I didn't know about the violence that can happen when highways are built between two competing, I guess, what's the correct term for this? I guess folks who sell drugs. So, you know, I didn't know. There we go. There we go. I was like, what's the PC term for this? But so just really making sure that collaboration is fostered. And we also need to make sure with public art that the art supports and reflects the diverse cultural heritage and the contemporary issues that New Yorkers face today. Like, are we actually representing people in the public work? Or are we just trying to just create something pretty and easily digestible? That was another piece of the Gems of Troy project. A lot of people wanted to see Uncle Sam and collars and things like that. And I'm like, I know that Troy is known for those historical people or items, but when I spoke to the community members, they didn't care about that. They didn't want to see Uncle Sam for the millionth time. They didn't want to see a manufacturer that made collars. Like, it's unfortunate, you know, a lot of people get weird when I say that, but they didn't. They wanted to see families. They wanted to see joy. They wanted to see soul. They wanted to see MMA fighters, boxers, people who've come up in Troy and have become successful and who have not moved on from Troy, but were able to use their abilities, creative or not, and build a successful life. So I really wanted to make sure on that project, I made sure to talk to people, to engage with people, to do surveys with folks with the support of the Art Center and CollarWorks and et cetera. So I just think keeping that intentionality is really important. I also run a program called Amplified Voices, where we focus on mentoring and growing young artists who live within creative deserts, who do want to be artists. You know, we make sure we collab with local youth organizations when we want to capture students. We also make sure that we provide a foundation of support and wellness. We do yoga every morning before the programs. We make sure that we collaborate with like Honest Weight Food Co-op to provide delicious meals for the children. You know, so really just making that holistic partnership with those around you and truly just listening to the voices of the people who you're working with on these projects is really important in my opinion. Like, what do the students want to see? What do the artists want to see? Like, we can't just keep creating art based off of what the city wants and what city organizations want or what politicians want. We need to create art that is meant for the people and by the people. And for success, when it comes to success for communities, I think ownership and representation is how it becomes successful. Are you being represented? Do you feel this is yours? Do you feel this mural or this piece of public art is a piece of art in your own house? I'm still surprised to this day none of my murals have been tagged. I've got one F Joe Biden on my mural, but Unsharpie, but that was it. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But it's like, but no one's tagged it because those ownership pieces, because they feel that's a piece of their, that's a piece of art in their home. And then for artists, I think feeling heard, feeling supported, being seen more than just a number and an economic builder and more seen as a cultural leader and a force for change. I think that's really, those are some things that make public art programs and projects successful if you view it from that lens.
Thank you, Jade. I knew we had the right person up here to direct that question to. If other folks have comments about the public art piece, I'd welcome them. I just also wanted to add that there's two other pieces of the governor's proposal, exciting proposal. One element that is which we recommended in our report, which is to create a fellowship program that will embed artists in state agencies. And another component that looks at opportunities to help regions and municipalities better market their local cultural attractions. In our report, we specifically recommended putting artists to work to market their local cultural spaces, venues, and assets. So I'd love to ask for everybody else on the panel, whether it's the public art proposal, the idea about more dollars to help market the arts locally, or this embedding artists in government, other thoughts about why and how to make those proposals successful?
I think I can start talking about embedding artists across sectors in government. I think Creators Rebuild is really excited about that work. I think it provides jobs for artists. I also think, the National Endowment for the Arts just announced a partnership with the EPA to embed artists across communities, across the U.S., in 6 historically important watershed areas. One of them is the Bronx, Passaic, and Harlem rivers. And so they're really pushing this sort of idea. That's not a new idea, right? Artists have been working in New York City as artists in residence across sectors and different agencies across the city for years. Both Washington State and Minnesota both have their departments of transportation, both house artists in residence. Boston has artists in residence. Oakland has cultural strategists and real cultural leaders, Jade, to your point. And groups like A Blade of Grass have created entire toolkits for folks to understand how to embed artists in municipalities. So I think, this work is powerful for all the reasons that we've talked about already. It provides jobs. It provides real out-of-the-box thinking in these agencies. And we're really excited that New York State might take the lead in really working this way.
Anybody wants to jump in on those three, absolutely feel free. I also just expand the conversation a little further towards some of the other recommendations that you all may have on the panel here. We want to tap your creative ideas. What's one thing that you think the state could do to better support the arts locally? Is there one thing that you think the state could do to better integrate the arts into the state's economic development strategies, tools, dollars? And I'm open this up to anybody. We have a little bit of time left. Would love your ideas for what the state could do.
I have an idea, but I didn't know if anyone wanted to go since I went.
So go for it.
Okay. So I'm a huge proponent of youth-centered programs. I work primarily with youth. I do work with adults a lot, but I am the eldest of 7. I'm 32. The youngest brother, I think, is 15. So I'm just a huge proponent of youth programming, how we can support our youth. I work in schools. I see how youth, and I'm talking, when I say youth, I mean from kindergarten up to 25 years old. College, basically kindergarten to college level. They're suffering. They are going through a lot. They have no way to they have nowhere to go. I've had my brother tell me, and my siblings tell me, where are we supposed to go? I don't like the mall anymore. We like art, but there's nowhere, Boys and Girls Club's not accessible to them. YWCA is accessible, but they may not have the art programs that they want. They're all artists. So where do they go? So I think more youth-centered art programs and programs like Amplified Voices, Albany Center Gallery has Artwork Space in collaboration with the Red Bookshelf, and there's so many other pioneering youth programming in the area, but I think we need to create career pathways in the arts for youth specifically. How can we provide comprehensive support and training and exposure to the art at an early age? So that way, when they become older, maybe they will fulfill some aspirations within the art sector. Will they become admin? Will they be curators? Will they just be individual artists? Will they be program makers like myself? We need to teach youth about the cultural enrichment and value of art. Young artists bring fresh and innovative ideas. I think some folks said that up here. They give a completely different perspective than what we're used to. So how can we utilize youth in the arts to help build and have a catalyst of ideas and innovation so we just keep flowing, it doesn't really get stale. And then, of course, the social impact and community engagement. We have a lot of crime in Troy, unfortunately, and it's, in my opinion, working with youth, it's due to just boredom sometimes. Sometimes it's just due to lack of access. People want to blame it on the parents or blame it on the schools, but I'm like, where are these kids going to go? What if your parent works all day, double shifts, trying to put food on your table, and then your kid just has to stay at home? I think somebody called them latchkey kids. That was the first time I heard that phrase, to be honest. But I'm like, oh my God, because my parents, they were always there. But so I'm just like, oh my God, so how can we support our youth who don't have access to arts, who do have creative intentions? But instead, they're just like, well, there's nowhere for me to go, so I'm gonna just run the streets, you know? So how can we utilize art as social impact and community engagement? And then, of course, we always wanna make sure we're inclusive and that we're accessible. That's another thing. How do we create placemaking projects, multiple placemaking projects, from like the fish market to create, to like flock art, to the Albany Center Gallery, you know, art space create, or art create space. Like, how can we keep continuing to create these placemaking projects where they're always in the vicinity of someone? It's always on the bus line. There's hours that work, like 3 to 6, 3 to 7, where kids can come, just hang out, create art, learn something. You know, be the best human that they can be with amazing mentors and artists. So I just feel like we need to do some more with our youth within the art sector and just provide some support for them, because a lot of youth I work with, they love art. They may not love painting, but they love videography, they love photography, you know, they love acting. So how can we foster that? So that way we're supporting them and we're not failing our kids.
So I want to grab some more. I see the hands, the nudging in really quickly, because I do want to get to questions from our audience as well. But if we could, for the folks that wanted to jump in, I think at least Erica, I know, and I saw Ryan's hand as well, one idea that you have, and then we'll take it over to the room for questions and we can keep the conversation going.
I'll go really quickly. I think that we need some sort of statewide task force to ensure that as communities become cooler, that the venues can remain, because this is what happens worldwide, right? The artists make the area cool, people start going to it, and then the venues can no longer afford the rent, or and. We all know what happens. We need to make sure that that isn't happening, because in Rochester, it is starting to happen. I know it's happening elsewhere, and we really, really need to put the brakes on that.
Thanks, Erica. Ryan?
I agree.
Yeah, I would say, and we've done this with housing, prioritize public arts within some of the existing programs, whether it's Restore New York, DRI, New York Forward. And I know some of the REDCs across the state do have either a committee or representation on the arts. Encourage more participation from the arts community within these existing infrastructures, because they're developing the plan, right, for what the future of the community, the economy looks like. Ensuring that they have a voice at the table, and frankly, where they don't, show up at the meetings and demand a seat at the table. Have that conversation with the leadership of those organizations to make sure that whatever strategic plan they're developing incorporates some component of the arts in the long-term strategy, which will in turn hopefully lead to more investment and funding flowing into those types of projects and initiatives across the state.
Thanks, Ryan. So we have a little bit of time for this first panel for some questions from our audience. The way it'll work, my colleagues have a microphone. They'll come around to you. Just let us, first of all, throw your hand up. I'll call on you. Let us know your name if you're here with an organization. And do try to keep your questions short so we can get to as many as possible. But show of hands if folks have questions. They want to, we'll go right to the middle of the room. A microphone's coming your way. Great. Thank you.
Corey Aldrich. I'm with ACE, Upstate Alliance for the Creative Economy. Kind of a general comment that dovetails on the fringe comment about venues. And we talk a lot about artist housing, but one of the things that I'm becoming acutely aware of is artists can have housing, but then the rents can go up and people get gentrified out of the space. So my interest is really on collective ownership structures for artists to participate in the real estate value proposition. I would love to hear thoughts on that.
We're involved in just creating our first community land trust taproot in the city of Kingston. All of our affordable, including the Lace Mills, regulated for 50 years. So for at least a half century, it's going to remain affordable. It's going to be in the nonprofits ownership, so we'll maintain it. But there's, I think, a lot of movement, and we're looking to do models that are home ownership or cooperative, but where we have resident ownership going forward. And so it's exciting. It's happening around the country, and we're working on it in the Hudson Valley.
That's great, Ryan. Thanks. Other questions? Just make sure I can see hands in the room. So one right there. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Jeff Macharis, Everson Museum of Art, Syracuse, New York. Visit us online at everson.org. So my question is about awareness. I have found that, a lot of people don't know, no matter how much money you put into marketing or communications, that they don't know you even exist or what you have. I went to a career fair at SUNY Oswego a couple of weeks ago, spoke to a lot of students in the arts program. Most of them didn't know the Everson existed or where it was. So my question is, how could we as a collective group make the arts more, make the awareness of arts better across the state? And, just paying for marketing is expensive, so that's not the only answer. It's one answer, but not the only one. What else can we do to help spread the word?
We're just going to jump in. I think that this dovetails with one of the report's recommendations about creating a back office that multiple organizations can use. And I think that part of that back office should be media buying. There are ways to reach young people. It's really, really hard, but it's not rocket science. And I think that if we were able to combine efforts and to share data as to, for example, if you're geolocating certain ads, if you're serving to certain podcasts, what is working for what demographic? And I think that having some sort of in-house media buyer, media planner in that back office would help everyone. All boats would rise.
I also think looking to our representatives, right, that they're often in these different spaces, and they should be championing the arts and the arts institutions within their cities. So when they're thinking about the various strategies of economic development or education, that they're always thinking about how can there be a synergistic relationship between the Everson Museum or the Red House or the Landmark Theater, all of these dynamic organizations right in the heart of our city. So I think that really calling upon them to make sure that they are again and again amplifying how we can be a vital part of those conversations would be really, really helpful.
Well, on that note, you talked about our representation. We are very pleased that we're joined by some of our elected representation today for the next part of our conversation. So if the audience would join me in a round of applause for our amazing panel. Thank you all so much, truly. Please just stick around, stay exactly where you are. We're gonna move directly into our second conversation. And thank you all again so much. And if our senators could come and join me up on the stage. Right through three right here. So we'll do, three in the middle. Yeah, that's perfect. Right. Perfect, yeah. All right, senators, come join me. Hey. I understand it's a busy day. Hey, Senator Ryan, good to see you. Good to meet you in person. Good to see you. Hey, good to see you again. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. Why don't you come over, grab these three in the middle. We'll just get right into it. Okay. Absolutely. I tried to straddle the line between policy forum, but also the arts. So I chose no tie. That was my concession today. But
you can't go wrong with the bow tie.
Yeah, I know.
When it comes to this world,
it's the perfect compromise. I gotta flush out my coffee a little bit. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I know, especially in a room full of artists and arts advocates, there's going to inevitably be a lot of talking. But if you could all join me back with your attention up here, we're going to move directly into our second conversation. And I appreciate everybody being here today. So it is first of all, for those who may be just tuning in now, and we have about 160 or so people tuned in virtually as well. Hello again, I am Eli Dvorkin, Editorial and Policy Director at the Center for an Urban Future. We just had an amazing first panel discussion framing out some of the key opportunities for the state to better support working artists and arts organizations, to better integrate the arts and culture sector into the state's economic development strategies and policies. And we are so privileged and honored to be joined today by two leaders in the state legislature, State Senator Jose M. Serrano, who chairs the Committee on Cultural Affairs, and State Senator Sean Ryan, who is the chair of the Committee on Commerce, Economic Development, and Small Business. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much. So, Senator Ryan, I wanted to start with you. We talked just the other day about the role that the arts has played in Buffalo over the past 10, 15 years in particular, the growing power of the arts and working artists themselves, to help create the conditions for Buffalo to really thrive. And we've started to see some of those results with small businesses starting and growing, with the slowdown of the population decline, and now starting to see the population increase in Buffalo. And certainly you see that reflected in the working artist figures, which has grown by a stunning 50% from 2011 to 2021, the number of working artists who reside in Buffalo. So Senator Ryan, I want to start with you. Given your vantage point overseeing the state legislature's work around economic development, what's working in Buffalo today when it comes to the power of the arts? Are you seeing evidence that this impact is real on the ground?
Yeah, I definitely do. And you might ask, what's the economic development person doing at an arts group, right? So we really view the arts as one of Buffalo's economic engines. We don't really view the arts that way, right? We talk about enrichment and expression, but it comes with a great economic development benefit if you look at it through that lens. And let me just take a minute to brag. When we talk about the Buffalo arts, we don't compare ourselves to New York City because that's not a good comparison. So we think of ourselves more as a small Midwestern city that happens to be on the western side of New York. But in the last 10 years, we've built a brand new museum, the Birchfield Penny Art Gallery. We've done a substantial remodeling and a expansion of the Albright Knox Art Gallery. We have the Irish Classical Theater. We have the Shays Buffalo Performing Arts. We have an active and healthy Philharmonic. We have the Frank Lloyd Wright Martin House. We have the Neglia Ballet. We have Buffalo State College, which is really an engine because they have several arts programs, whether it's fine arts, fabric, design, arts restoration. And then at the same time, we like to say we have the big arts and then the not so big arts. So we have a vibrant youth arts scene. We have several programs that really developed in the last 10 years about youth in the arts. But it's always a challenge to say art's important for all the obvious reasons, plus, the economic development. And we're sort of lost, arts is always transitioning, right? So 10 to 15 years ago, your play was, you can come to Buffalo, and for the cost of your studio apartment, you can get a 2-bedroom apartment and a studio. Well, as economic conditions are changing, our sales pitch has changed there, and our arts community has matured. And I guess I would put a plug in, too, for the last few years. NISCA has really done things differently, and they have funded projects in the 8 counties of Western New York. Places in Western New York probably never received that type of funding, are at the table. So it's a real different challenge, but part of the challenge that I have as the chair of the Economic Development Committee is try to get the usual thinkers to change their minds about the importance of arts in the economy. We don't think twice about giving $1 billion to Elon Musk and Tesla to have a failed factory. But my gosh, try to get $100,000 arts grants, and you have to go through underwriting like you wouldn't believe. So we're trying to change that. So it's good to be here, and your paper has been it's been shooting around Buffalo, so it's great.
That's great to hear, Senator. Thank you. I want to ask you more about how we do what you just laid out, but we'll get there in just a second. But I want to talk about another aspect of, you talked about, Senator Ryan, what it takes to shift sort of the mindset around what economic development is or should be. And Senator Serrano, I want to ask you something similar. And this may seem surprising to someone such as yourself, obviously, who's been a vocal champion for the arts for many, many years and is well known in New York City for your advocacy for the arts. But my question for you is, we've seen certainly historically, and I think still the case today, it's not always clear that there's going to be the same level of support from legislators from upstate New York, as we've kind of inherently come to believe that's just the default approach for New York City's Albany delegation. So my question for you is, because I think to Senator Ryan's point, it's not just the economic development opportunities that often go overlooked. It's also harnessing support for the arts across the rest of New York State. So I wanted to ask you, what is it going to take? Do you agree that more needs to happen to mobilize that support from your upstate colleagues, and how do you get there?
Well, first of all, Eli, thank you so much for having me, and it's so great to be with my good friend, Senator Sean Ryan. And I think it's perfectly logical that you're here because our conversations over the years about the arts and culture have been very in-depth, and I certainly know of your commitment to Western New York for the arts. And thank you, Center for an Urban Future, for that wonderful report, which helps us to give real sort of ammunition to us making the case for the need for more enhanced arts funding in places outside of New York City. But to your point about sort of the upstate arts economy or throughout the state of New York, I mean, looking at the city of New York, where I represent East Harlem and the South Bronx. As chair of the Committee of Cultural Affairs, I try to keep a close eye on the way that the arts are helping communities. Are they being transformative? Are they providing all of the things that we believe they do provide? Well, it's easy to see in New York City, we wouldn't be the city that we are without the arts and culture. When you think about why companies or why entrepreneurs or why schools want to be part of New York City, it is always leaning on that cultural factor. The fact that you are in the cultural center in a place like New York City. What's interesting, though, is over the past few years, I'm seeing more of a diversity within that arts movement. What was mainly a midtown Manhattan or downtown art scene, you're starting to see that in the South Bronx where I live. With the, for years, stalwarts like Bragones Theater or the Puerto Rican Traveling Theater, now you have the Universal Hip Hop Museum coming to my neighborhood. And it's giving tourists who would normally come to New York City and spend money there and help all the other industries that are part of the economic development apparatus, hospitality, you name it. But they're venturing to other places in New York City. Brooklyn has long been a good draw, but the Bronx and East Harlem now, folks are coming because they want to learn more about the birthplace of hip hop. They want to learn more about the cultural phenomena in all these places. What I have seen statewide, which is interesting in the last few years, is we have more of a geographic diversity in the support for the arts. And I see that in our discussions in our conference, which was, was a very New York City centric conversation when I first got elected here in 2004. But I've noticed over the years with the election of new individuals like Senator Ryan and folks throughout upstate New York, Western New York, out on Long Island, they're clamoring for arts funding. They're talking to their arts organizations and institutions on the ground. They know that the art scene is just really at that point where with that extra support can mean so much for them. So when you talk about economic development tools and trying to find ways to help boost economies that are not doing as well in upstate New York and out in Western New York, one of the most proven economic engine factors is the arts and culture. About 14 years ago, I did a visit to Syracuse to look at the emerging, very organic arts and cultural situation, that groundswell that was happening there, and how it was transforming neighborhoods that had long been left behind. And you see it there. So if you think about an investment in the arts, there's so many things that we do in our budget. We give money to it thinking we're going to get some sort of return, but we don't. An investment in the arts has a much bigger return than the amount of money that we put in. We've seen it in New York City. We've seen it in the South Bronx and in Syracuse. So I think statewide, the voices of elected officials in other areas is becoming stronger for it.
Well, that's encouraging, Senator Strong. And I think something that then plays to the question, Senator Ryan, I want to ask you, which is a similar one, looking at a different set of different pots of money. The growing awareness, appreciation from folks in the state legislature of the role that the arts and culture sector plays in their communities. I would certainly agree, and from all the research that we did, it's grown. But when it comes to actually mobilizing those economic development dollars, we haven't made a lot of progress. We calculated all of the REDC grants from 2021, and only about 3.7% of those dollars actually went to arts and culture projects. We're not saying it should be 100% or maybe even 50%, but given the success that the arts and culture sector's had, when, as you pointed out, a lot of other state-level investments in economic development have had, I would say, mixed results. You might characterize it otherwise. It's striking to see that gap. Similarly, we looked at the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, which, the name alone, I think for many folks would suggest a major focus on the arts, but only 12 out of 104 projects in 2022, the last year we were able to calculate all the data, were related to arts and culture. Seems like a striking kind of disparity there too. So what's needed now to more fully harness and integrate the arts and culture sector into the state's economic development planning?
You know, I think we just have to have a mindset shift. So, you know, we probably all remember some of the bad old days when they stopped the federal funding to the arts and wanted to do censorship on it. So I don't think we've fully recovered as a political culture about government's roles in the arts. And what we do a lot is we put arts and money into the arts, but we do it sideways. There's no program set up. So when Buffalo announced their expansion of the Albright Knox, has anyone been there, by the way? Got to go to the new one. Yeah, it's great. But we put 40% of the money to pay for that came from New York State. But there's no line in the budget, you know, museum expansions. So instead, we were able to drib money in over several years. So a lot of the funding, as I say, is more of a sideways. Last year, Senator Serrano and I, you know, we joined forces with other Upstate members to talk about some of the Upstate historic theaters. Big institutions, expensive to maintain, but no money for them. So we did put together a pot of money for, I think, the 12 or 13 Upstate theaters. But you're not going to see some budget line, you know, besides New York State Council for the Arts, which has not been growing. I got it. So I'm hoping that as we expand our understanding of the arts with reports like yours, we could have more of a sort of full-throated embrace about just direct arts funding. Like my county started doing their own arts funding a couple of years ago. It had been canceled under the other administration. You could only guess the political party of the other county executive who zeroed out the arts. But, you know, we were able to bring it all back. So I see it also emerging, you know, sort of from the locals also, then we sometimes follow suit. But I would say the strongest thing that's happened in my time in office that's going to make arts funding more possible is the people who support the arts has changed. You know, it used to be my mom and her friends. And now you see the arts community as is younger, more diverse. And that was done from a lot of intentionality by a lot of the institutions. But at the same time, you're getting a cry from the small arts saying, what about me? And those small arts are often what's bringing in different types of artists, you know, diversity. So I think we're all heading in the right direction, but boy, would we like to get there a little faster.
Well, I appreciate that, Senator. And I think you brought up NISCA funding and just in general, other pots of money that may not be thought of as arts funding, but we have one that is, you know, the NISCA's grant-making budget. And so, Senator Serrano, I want to ask you a little bit about this. In part because, you know, in our report, we calculated NISCA's grant-making budget going back, you know, over 40 years to really try to understand the trajectory there. And we found that there's been about a 36% decline in NISCA's grant-making budget since 2008. About a 68% decline after adjusting for inflation since it peaked back in 1990. So to be fair, there has been a slow and steady increase in NISCA's funding in general over the past decade or so, but we're not even close to where we were, you know, 10, 15, 20, and 30 years ago. At the same time, the needs and I think the opportunities have both grown. And yet we invest as a state billions of dollars in economic development projects by comparison. We are still talking about, to be clear, you know, an amount of money that is less than $50 billion a year. So talk to me a little bit, Senator, about how important it is for the governor and for the state legislature to get behind an increase in NISCA's budget, which you've called for certainly, and what else is needed legislatively that could help unlock more of this opportunity for the arts?
Well, that's a great question, and yes, the answer is resoundingly yes. We need more money. We need to expand the pie. We need to make sure that NISCA has what it needs to be able to support all of these artists and all of these grant applications that are coming in. And over the last 3 years, I should note that because of a combination of increased funding, especially from the federal government during COVID, we saw a huge uplift in NISCA funding. And I was like, this is great. This is going to be the new floor. You know, that we're going to just stay here and then just keep going up from here. Then the financial realities of post-COVID and then the governor's executive budget pretty much had us where we were pre-COVID. Now, I do believe the governor supports the arts and culture. I think everyone does, right? What I love about being chair of this committee is that the arts are not a wedge issue. You know, the arts are something that everyone loves. Where we differ is in how we get there. How do we get to the emerging artists? How do we get to the smaller arts organizations? You know, over the past few years, you know, there's been, I think, more of an attempt to try to get grants out to a sort of a whole new group of people, which is wonderful. And you make some people happy, you upset some other people. You know, what we have to do is expand the pie so that everyone can partake in what is intrinsically important about arts funding. So what I think is you know, we're in the middle of the budget process right now. So we have an executive budget that had a number in it. And we as a legislature are formulating our response to that through our legislative budget one house resolution, which will be coming out shortly. And we hope to try to show where we stand on that. And then we really get into the negotiating process and we try to find a way. What I think is so important about your report, but just also the diversity and the geography of thinking about the arts, is that we have to view the arts as foundational. We have to view them as a pillar within our society that we cannot live without. That we cannot function as a society without housing, without education, without all of those things that we never touch. We should have the arts in there as well as one of those foundational underpinnings of the society that we know and love. Interestingly, we have found something that I've known. I used to work in theater. My first job out of college back in 1995, I worked in theater. And one of the best things that I learned through that experience was the perfect vehicle for social justice that the arts presents. There is nothing I have found in all my years in government that allows people to become less stratified on the most tricky of issues or the most divisive of issues. The arts finds a way to present them in a way that we all coalesce around the movement for a better place, even though we may be coming from different areas in order to do that. I use as an example, when I was a young person in theater, no one was talking about the ravages of HIV/AIDS except the artists. The politicians didn't want to touch it. Federal government wasn't doing anything about it. People were dying. But the artists were the ones putting it on stage, putting it in their writing, and it gave us the opportunity as a society to focus on how the arts can create positive change. So I think if you sort of frame it in that way, and that's something that Senator Ryan, myself, and many others are attempting to do, it sort of takes arts funding out of a place of, you know, we'll sort of look at this and how it works out in the budget, to making it a priority and hopefully getting that number. Last year, I think we landed on $92 million was the grant side in NISCA. I was kind of hoping that that would be the floor and keep, you know, building from there.
Appreciate that, Senator. And so folks understand that included, you know, $40 million that was federal money, the grant making budget.
It could have been. I don't know exactly where all the money came from. I know we had it, but it was, you know, how it came to us is I'm not entirely sure. But it is safe to say that last year and the two prior budgets had a major infusion of COVID dollars that don't exist anymore. Oh, exactly. The federal government's not giving us that anymore. So now we're sort of back to reality.
I think a lot of the organizations we've spoken to across the state, which benefited from that increase in funding, are now understandably really concerned that if we go back to, as you said, where we were in 2019, that effectively is a significant cut.
Yeah, because how do you plan for your next what employees you're going to hire or not, or you're sort of trying to get past the anxiety that comes with budgets and knowing what you can possibly do next season. You need to plan for that now.
Let me ask one other question about state level policy, and it's an opportunity. It's something that we're really excited about. The three proposals that under the heading of Arts Pluribus Unum that were in the Governor's State of the State address. We talked about this in the first panel. It includes three key components: a public art program, an initiative to embed artists in state agencies, which is a recommendation from our report as well, and a new initiative as yet kind of undefined around marketing local and regional cultural assets and attractions. So I'm curious, in general, for your thoughts on the prospects of those three proposals, if you support them, and if so, what would it take to make sure that they not only happen, but are as effective as possible?
I would say the most important thing about that proposal is that the governor made a proposal specifically about the arts. So I think that's a great jumping off point to better things. So how this particular proposal fares, I don't know, but it is now on the governor's plate. And I think that is a huge thing, because if not, how our budgeting works, it's if the governor leaves it off, then we have to sort of scrounge under the couch cushions to find some extra money to put in there. But if it's coming from the executive budget, that gives us much more room for growth. So I'm encouraged that in the budget book, this proposal was made. And I think it's a real recognition of the importance of arts. And it's certainly something that I support.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think the governor mentioning this and making this a priority for her and for her administration, I think it bodes well for the larger conversation about the arts. I don't know all the details behind the proposal, and over time we will get all that fleshed out. But I think anything that gives more opportunities for local artists to keep doing what they do and love is a wonderful thing. I think the big concern that I've always been afraid of is that, artists will not be able to afford to do what they love, and they retreat into either they leave the state or they do other things, and they can't really afford to do it and put food on their table and pay their rent. So finding more opportunities to give artists work, to allow them to continue to hone their craft, to make sure they have space and places in which to present and create all that transformational things that I mentioned earlier, I think is very important. So it is encouraging. We look forward to working with her on that.
And I would just add to that, earlier I said a lot of the arts funding sort of comes sideways, but having the governor lay out 3 points, that's a very intentionality there, and that's much easier to build on.
That's really exciting. I also want to steal an idea from Sarah that was not quite mentioned in the first panel, but to the point of embracing an artist fellowship program in government, to even just begin by understanding the artists that already work in government, potentially on your own staff. How many folks that work at the state capitol right now are artists, and how does that look if you look at agencies and county level agencies across the whole state? So I was excited by that idea, just wanted to give it a little airtime, but there's no question that artists are already working in state government, but they're not recognized for that work. And then the idea of embedding artists in parts of government that they've never been before, I think is incredibly encouraging. Senator, to your point, that's how artists can be brought to the table to help solve some of these other big challenges, whether it's, the opioid epidemic or addressing trauma from the pandemic. Artists are uniquely well positioned to do that work, but we don't have, as you put it, Senator Ryan, that's a backdoor sideways, funding right now. There aren't programs that do just that. So I want to turn it over to our amazing audience. For folks that are tuned in online, you can tweet at NYC Future if you have a question for either of the state senators. Folks in the room, the hands are already going up. So as before, please lift your hand up. Let me know who you are, where you're from, and please keep your questions brief. We'll try to get to as many as possible, and we'll go right here to the first table, and the microphone is coming your way.
Hi, and is it on? Thank you. I'm Tammy Dillon with Hudson Hall in Hudson, New York, and I guess I'd like to thank you both. I thought this was a really wonderful panel discussion, as I did the whole thing, so thank you for coordinating this. But with regard to funding coming sideways to the arts, we're the recipient now for, I guess, 4 years running of Market New York funding to help us establish and develop the Hudson Jazz Festival as a destination event. And I'd like to just note and possibly suggest something that could help arts organizations. As you know, we're required for a 30% MWBE. I'd say about 90% of our budget goes to artists and consultants of color, many of whom are also women. They are small proprietors, sole proprietors. Many of the musicians are going gig to gig. The certification process is onerous, and if there could possibly be a streamlined certification process for sole proprietors, that would be hugely helpful. I would actually argue that the MWBE certification is discriminatory in practice. So thank you.
Thoughts on improving the MWB certification process at the state level?
There's a whole subcommittee right now only reviewing NWBE. It expires this year. Usually you get a multi-year renewal, but we're only going to renew it for 1 year. And hopefully in that 1 year period, the task force will come up with recommendations. You won't be surprised to hear this. You're not the first one to have brought that to our attention.
Thanks, no, appreciate the question. Other questions in the room? We'll go to Jen, and then also if there are artists in the room that have a question, I would love to take my moderator's, prerogative and say, I'd love to hear from any of the artists in the room as well. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Jen Swan from Art Services, Inc. in Western New York. Thank you very much for this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about, we talked a little bit about the investment in the New York State Council on the Arts, obviously is being that direct arts funding. And then Senator Ryan, you mentioned, kind of that sideways investment, RADC, we have a lot of these other opportunities like Market New York that we can fund through the arts. But I guess, a larger kind of planning out for long-term sustainability for arts funding. Do either of you, both of you, have any recommendations of how we can kind of build this infrastructure of looking at, so there's NISCA funding, and then there's these other maybe processes that can be created, maybe in the short term, maybe in the long term, for these alternate arts funding. Senator Serrano, you talked about arts as a vehicle and thinking about a vehicle for multiple different things, and thinking about building this infrastructure, but also the room of individuals here, everyone online. We have all of our arts lenses, our experiences. How can we help you to really build that infrastructure and that long-term sustainability plan for arts funding?
Well, I think you're doing it. I think the discussions like this we had. I hosted an Arts Day a couple of weeks ago in Albany, and the budget hearing prior to that was well attended, and there was a lot of groups. I think the use of social media, the way that everyone is sort of talking about the arts as a statewide phenomena, and that we're looking at new avenues in which to develop funding and in which we're looking to support. There's also a lot of capital needs that a lot of arts organizations and institutions have. It's sometimes a little bit easier to get hold of that funding, although sometimes harder to spend. But there is real need for that as arts organizations modernize or look for new space or create new HVAC systems that are compliant and responsive to the COVID situation. There is a lot of need on all of those fronts. So I think what you're doing and helping to organize and bringing about this sort of discussion is really what gets people listening, including the governor, including the legislature.
And I would jump in on that, it was the local arts community that brought back Erie County's arts funding. So you brought the game, and I would say to everyone here, what program do you want to see funded for next year? Don't be constrained by what we currently do, but make program suggestions to us that we could then carry forward.
Thank you. Question right here. Yes. I know, just one quick second. The microphone will come your way just in case the whole room can hear you.
Hi there. My name is Sean Sawyer. I'm the president of the Alana Partnership down in Hudson. I'm also on our Columbia County Economic Development Corporation board. And so I'm seeing this conversation from both those sides, and certainly getting a big kick in the pants to go back to the CEDC board and have some conversations where we've been trying to get arts more integrated. But I think one of the things in my 9 years upstate, moving from the city to work up here, I've noticed is this real disconnect about what how important nonprofits are in the cycle. And that, in Hudson, for instance, there's a huge turnover, so many grant dollars giving to businesses that last 6 months and vanish. And, that people literally jump over themselves to give economic development money to private businesses and private developers. But the nonprofits have not changed. All the businesses in Hudson have changed in 9 years. None of the nonprofits have gone away. We've weathered COVID, we've done all this because we're rooted in the community with boards that are philanthropic and in the community. And I don't think there's enough appreciation of that in the arts as a real funding mechanism.
Thank you. We've got one more question from the back, and I think that might be all the time we have.
Hi, thank you so much, and also for the first panel. My name is Naomi. I'm coming from Newburgh, New York. One of the things, this is not really a question, it's more of a point to consider, is I think it's important for small towns and cities like Newburgh to have a cultural plan, that the planning is not just having a document, it gets the community mobilized like you were referring to before, but it's also a tool for when developers are coming or philanthropists are inquiring. It's a plan that has been voiced and united and seen and commented by so many people that it leads away, right? We shouldn't be investing in the arts without a direction, and it changes over time. But we need something that we can always refer back to as opposed to it being sporadic. And so that's something when it comes to these different funding mechanisms, does that municipality have arts and cultural planning as a document that can be referred to? So that's it.
Just to sort of jump off of that comment, we have sort of naturally occurring arts communities throughout the state of New York. You see a lot of that in New York City, and we try to find ways to be supportive of that because it's very organic growth. And it usually has the most sustainable growth because it brings in a lot of people from the community. I have legislation on cultural districts throughout the state of New York, which will help in providing sort of the technical help that emerging arts communities can then hone in on and create a cultural district, which would allow them to sort of have that bit of planning, you know, and hopefully organize and be a united front for better support for the arts. So, you know, I think it's happening organically. I think what's great about the artist community is that they're often not shy about talking about what it is that they need. But I think it's really important that we as elected officials, that we hear all of this, that we then are armed with this information when we go back into our conference room, and that we sort of find new and innovative ways to ensure that we're supporting the arts in every corner.
Thank you, Senator. I think we have one more time for one more question. Liz, why don't you go for it? Microphone coming your way, just to the middle table there. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for today's discussion. My name is Elizabeth Reese, and I'm at the Arts Center of the Capital Region. I just wanted to maybe illustrate one point that perhaps wraps up a lot of today's dialogue. We at the Arts Center are responsible for administering re-grants for the New York State and New York State Council on the Arts. And just as a point of illustration of this area, in 2022, we received 12 applications from artists for funding. Last year, we received 170. Artists are here, we're going to stay, and on behalf of them, I'm going to say thank you for your funding and your advocacy for New York and New York artists. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll close on that.
That was the perfect note, Liz, so thank you so much. If everybody could join me in a round of applause for our amazing panelists, state senators, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here. Thank you to Creators Rebuild New York for making today's event possible with us. The galleries on floor 2 are open, so if folks want to check out the exhibitions here in the museum, please do go check it out. Even better. So, you know, exit through the gift shop. And thank you all so much for being here today. Great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.